Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Ethics Fundamentals series. I'm Cheryl Kane Piasecki, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by David Myers. David is a program analyst in our compliance division, and David's going to be talking today about ethics program model practices that our compliance division has seen in conducting reviews across the executive branch and different executive branch ethics programs. And I'm really pleased that David is with us today. So welcome, David.
Thank you.
Before we get started with David, I have a few introductory remarks and a few announcements that I'd like to make before David and I get started. First, it's with sadness that we note the passing of an OGE former director, Rick Cusick. Director Cusick served at OGE from 2006 until 2011. And he believed very strongly that public office should never be an occasion for self-congratulation or for, as he put it, nest feathering, but rather that it should focus on honorable and ethical service to the public. And so we extend our most sincere condolences to Mr. Cusick's family and his friends. And now on to announcements, something slightly less morose. Next Thursday, we will be doing the Advanced Practitioner Series, and Patrick and Ryan will be joining you next week. They're going to be talking about, it's an introduction to enterprise risk management. And you may be asking yourself, okay, Cheryl, what is enterprise risk management? They're basically going to be introducing a framework for managing risk in your organizations. And the conversation is going to be basically focusing around how do you proactively identify programmatic risk areas for ethics risks throughout your organization, identifying programs and areas that have the greatest potential for ethics risk, assessing those, and then coming up with strategies for mitigating those risks. The idea here is this is a strategy for engaging your leadership in your organization, and certainly for a way of getting buy-in from your leadership into your ethics program functions. So look forward to that. Next week we'll be going out with an announcement with that later this week. Next, as evidence of the fact that we do actually look at the evaluations that you submit for our courses, some of you requested more Lee Francis. So we've heard your request, and we plan to grant your wish. In January for the Fundamental Series on January 8th, Seth Jaffe, who is our Deputy General Counsel, will be joined by Lee Francis, who is also of our General Counsel's office, and they are going to be talking about the term related to official duties as that applies to the teaching, speaking, and writing provisions in the Standard of Conduct provisions at 2635.807. So again, stay tuned for that in January. That'll be our fundamental series in January. And then TPDS is very excited to announce that beginning in January, we're going to roll out the first of several initiatives that we are going to undertake over the next 6 to 9 months to assist you with the planning and the development of annual employee ethics training. We know this is an area we've received a clarion call for help in this area. And so we are making that a priority for our resources this fiscal year. So starting in January, you'll be hearing about the first part of that initiative. And then throughout the next 6 to 9 months, we're going to be rolling out various things to help you, again, assist you with your planning and your actual development of your annual employee ethics training. And so without further ado, welcome, David, again.
Thank you.
How are you doing today?
Doing well.
That's great. We're so excited that you're with us. We really look forward to being able to have program management aspects on the Fundamental Series, and you are one of our resident experts, and so we've got kind of the best and the brightest here today. You're very lucky.
Too kind.
So, David, why don't you start out by sharing a little bit about what the compliance division actually looks for when you go into an agency and you conduct, and there are various things you conduct. It's either an investigation, correct, or an inspection or an actual review. So if you could talk a little bit about like the difference between those and then what actually it is that you're looking for when you go in.
Okay, sure. Well, the role of OG's Program Review Branch is to evaluate the effectiveness of an agency's ethics program. Mm-hmm. We do this by evaluating or measuring the program compliance with various rules and regulations. Now, Our goal is to conduct over a 4-year period a program review at every executive branch agency. Now, during our reviews, we go in and we look at various elements of the ethics program. This would include the ethics program structure and staffing.
Sure.
We look at how the financial disclosure system is governed, both public and confidential. We look at how the agency is implementing the ethics training requirement, as well as how they're rendering ethics training and advice. Now, I just want to say that many times that we're not auditors and we're not investigators. And many times that we're unfairly labeled as the ones that come in after the battle and bayonet all the wounded.
Oh my goodness!
Contrary to popular belief, that's not true. We consider ourselves to be friendly ethics consultants. So when we come in, part of what we do is that from time to time, we see mechanisms or what we like to call model practices that an agency may have implemented to help increase the transparency or consistency or accuracy of their particular ethics program. So when we identify these practices, we like to share them when it appears that it may benefit another agency. So part of what we're doing is we're looking to identify risks and we're looking to identify the strengths of the program. Right? And so we do that through our evaluation, and then we're looking at the weaknesses of the program. Today we're going to talk more about the strengths of the program through what we have identified through model practices.
So this is the positive side
it's all positive, but this is the positive side, correct.
Okay. Well, before you go into like different model practices that you may have seen with with each of the different elements that you were outlining earlier about the different program elements that you actually look at for strengths and weaknesses, can you talk a little bit about, are there areas where you either find the biggest problems, or you consistently find some of the most common good practices? I mean, are there trends that you see or have seen in agencies, both with respect to either weaknesses or strengths, or with respect to both?
Absolutely. Generally, in the areas of program administration, financial disclosure, and education and training are generally the elements that we see agency ethics officials having the most challenges in, as well as we see ethics officials overcoming those challenges through the various model practices that they have implemented. Through the program administration aspect of the program, a lot of times what we see is the lack of leadership support at some agencies. And as you know, leadership is it's very important.
It's critical.
At the highest levels of the agency, it's very important that leadership is involved in the ethics program. One of the things that we see to counter that is that we've identified a number of agencies that include their agency leadership in the involvement of ethics, and we see that in a number of different ways. For example, we see where agency leadership has incorporated ethics into their senior staff meetings. We see where leadership has incorporated, sent out memorandums to support the activities of the ethics office. We acknowledge that going into a program that not every, and I wanted to stress this, that the model practices that we find, it's just like a pair of shoes. It's not a one-size-fit-all. So sometimes the model practices that are working at a cabinet level agency may not be the same model practices that are needed at a small micro agency or even a mid-sized agency. So what we try to do is evaluate the needs of the agency and try to best look at the model practice that we think that would help benefit that particular agency.
Now, when you talk about leadership, I know you and I were discussing this the other day. I think it's helpful for people to understand that when you're talking about leadership, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is the most senior leadership, which would be the heads of the agencies. But we were talking a little bit more about how you don't want to ignore or not factor in sort of leadership at lower levels of management as well.
Exactly. Yeah, what we find, it's funny because I often see where sometimes there's a lack of communication, even with supervisors, and I consider that part of the leadership chain.
Absolutely.
A lot of times we have a emphasis on making sure that, for instance, if you're at a cabinet level agency, you want to make sure that the secretary has the highest visibility when it comes to ethics. But a lot of times we forget about the undersecretaries, or we forget about the supervisors that also play a significant part in supporting the ethics program. So what we look at when we look at at model practices, we not only look at what the senior leadership is doing in terms of the director or the secretary, but we're also looking at ways in which you are incorporating your supervisors into the flow of administering your program, as well as the undersecretaries or those in the intermediate chain of command.
So would you say that maybe one way that you've seen that that agencies do incorporate supervisors and integrate them into the actual functioning of the program would be through things like, I don't know, maybe like financial disclosure review or things like that? Or are there other areas where you see them try to integrate leadership?
Yeah, one of the best examples of how you can incorporate supervisors particularly is in the area of financial disclosure. A lot of times agencies have the challenge of not being able to timely identify employees that are transferring into a covered position or those that are acting in a covered position. And a lot of times what we find is that the common procedure is to rely on the personnel office to inform the ethics office about when an employee is coming in or being promoted into a covered position or when he's acting. But what we find is that a good model practice is to also incorporate supervisors into that mix. And you could do that. I was just at an agency the other day where they were having challenges in identifying those employees that were entering a covered position. They were already current employees at the agency, but they were either acting in a position and that 61st day triggered that they would have to file a financial disclosure report. And what they decided to do was they decided to, on a quarterly basis, send out email reminders to the supervisors and have the supervisors, one, it served as a purpose of reminding them of the filing requirement, but they also asked that they send them the names of any of their employees that were actually serving in an acting position. So that way they could get a better handle in real time on how to actually identify those employees that are transferring or acting in a covered position. I've also noticed that more agencies are using their IT department, where usually IT is generally the first division that will know when a person is coming on board or when a person is changing their title or being promoted. So they're using their technology divisions a lot more. And what I always tell agency ethics officials that to be an ethics official, it's about building relationships.
Yes.
And it's not just about staying within the ethics the ethics office, but it's branching out to the other divisions to help you incorporate the aspects of the program.
And I think one of the good messages that sends supervisors too, when you can integrate supervisors into this thing, is number one, they have a shared responsibility for the ethics program, that this is part of their oversight and supervisory responsibility. I love the idea that this helps remind them of like who's supposed to be filing and why they're supposed to be filing. I don't think they can hear that enough. But so are there other areas of program management or financial disclosure where you've seen other model practices that are related to those areas?
Well, in general, what we find, particularly in financial disclosures, a lot of the challenges that we find when it comes to financial disclosure are generally in the timeliness aspects, the timeliness of review, the timeliness of having filers receive their reports on time. Right. So a lot of the model practices that we see are generally address that area. So, for example, in the area of financial disclosure, one particular agency had a challenge in timely addressing new entrants that are coming on board. In this case, not so much the public filers, but it was their confidential filers. So what they decided to do, and I thought it was a great process or practice, was what they decided to do was they implemented a process where they provided their prospective employees with a copy or blank of the financial disclosure report. And what they did was they allowed that served two purposes. One, it ensured that the report would be timely filed because the report had to be filed before the prospective employee came on board.
Oh, so even before they
came on duty, they had to file.
Okay.
And then the other thing that they did was that it gave them a jump start on trying to remedy any potential conflicts that the prospective employee would potentially have when he came on board. So a lot of times we've also seen in areas where large agencies sometimes have the challenge of not being able to identify when when employees are actually coming on board. So what some agencies have done is that they've incorporated in the vacancy announcement as well as the position description that the particular position is subject to filing a financial disclosure report. That serves two purposes. One, it triggers personnel office that they know exactly when an employee is coming on board, they know that it triggers the filing. But also it brings some accountability to the actual filer, because they know that in taking this position, there's a responsibility that they have to file a financial disclosure report, which ultimately will go a long way in serving their needs in having them timely file annually.
Right. Well, and I think that there are a couple of points that come to mind for me with that particular practice, particularly like the pre-vetting, because I have heard horror stories from agencies, and I don't know how often it happens, but it definitely happens, where someone is brought on board, they're declared to be a financial disclosure filer after they've been brought on board, they file a financial disclosure form, and they find out that the person has these tremendously disqualifying interests that have to be remedied before this person can even begin to assume the duties that they want to perform. And this person wasn't fully advised in advance that they would have to be probably making some significant financial sacrifices, or even worse, that their spouse would have to be making these financial sacrifices. And then you've created a situation where maybe the employee doesn't even want to continue to accept the employment, and it all could have been avoided if there had been some pre-vetting of this person for ethics purposes.
And that's exactly when agencies make the filing of a financial disclosure report a condition of employment.
Absolutely.
And I think that's it really does help. There are also some agencies that go one step further by providing ethics training material in the job announcement, in the job letter, the offer of the job, and then that also brings more accountability to the program. Also, it brings awareness.
Yes.
From the prospective employees side of it.
Now, in the agencies where you found that they included in the PD, where they had already flagged the PD as a financial disclosure position, a filing position. So then, was it your experience then that it was the personnel office or the HR office who like put together whatever their new employee packet was, that would be then their responsibility to include a financial disclosure form in that packet, or did you see how that actually then played out?
It just depends. There's some agencies, unfortunately, that they don't have the relationship that we would like to see with their personnel office. So sometimes you would see a process where the personnel office does that heavy lifting, but then we would also see where the ethics office would be more involved, and they would take over that aspect of the program. So I was at an agency where part of the personnel process was that they had to get a conflict of interest screening prior to even hiring or offering the job. And I thought that was extremely helpful, because they were in a position that they were having challenges, and that was one of the things that they did to address that.
And it's funny, because I have had some agencies who wanted to institute that for certain positions that they knew were ones that were likely to have conflicts of interest. Their question was, is that provided for in the regulation? And the answer is yes. The confidential financial disclosure regulation allows for like a pre-vetting for conflicts, correct?
Sure. And the good thing about that, and what we always support and always goes full circle, is that one reason that they were able to do that as well was because they got the buy-in from agency leadership. And Absolutely. It all ties back to the support of agency leadership. And so we've seen a number of those situations where there were challenges that the agency had, and whether it be we came in to provide particular suggestion on model practice, or they were more they developed their own practice and wanted to share it with others. We've seen it in a number of different ways.
So we talked a little bit about program administration. We've talked a little bit about financial disclosure. How about education and training? I think that's an area that a lot of agencies struggle with.
Yeah, I always tell agencies that when it comes to education and training, this is where you can be the most creative. This is where you can really be as creative and as innovative as possible. A lot of the model practices that we have identified in areas of education and training are really simple but effective. So, for instance, we know that the education training regulation is bare bones minimum.
Absolutely.
And so for example, when it comes to initial ethics orientation training, we know that the regulation is that you provide written training to a new employee within 90 days. That meets the basic requirement. But what would be a model practice from our perspective is when we see agencies that are providing in-person training to employees during their onboarding process. What we found to be a model practice is when we see the agency leadership incorporated into the new hirings initial ethics orientation. We've seen agencies go as far as actually having the agency leadership come in to some of the initial ethics orientation trainings to give their introduction. We also seen it through video form, but to give their awareness, to give their support of the program. This is also an area, excuse me, this is also an area where when it comes to the annual training requirement, we know that the basic requirement is that you provide written training to or provide in-person training to public filers or written training to confidential filers to meet the bare bones basics. But a model practice, when we see model practices in the area of annual training, we like to see that you provide training to all your employees.
Right.
I want to touch back on initial ethics orientation. Sometimes I tell agencies to look at it this way. And we always hear, I don't have time to provide training and things like that. But I often when you look at initial ethics orientation, excuse me, when you look at initial ethics orientation, you get to the point where, because for some employees, initial ethics orientation may be their only formal exposure to government ethics, because when you look at initial ethics orientation is to be given to all employees, but annual training is only to be given to those who file either a public or confidential report. So if an employee never reaches the level of having to file either a public or a confidential report, and they're at an agency that doesn't have a practice of providing in-person training annually, then generally their only formal exposure to ethics, government, or is the initial ethics orientation. But if you provide that in written form, and generally it's provided with all the other HR personnel information and things like that, but if you provide it that way, generally you're missing out on a golden opportunity to provide or to let employees know about the standards, let them know about the agency rules.
Well, in so many respects, I mean, it's really a disservice to your employees, because at the end of the day, we are all responsible for complying with, and for conducting ourselves in compliance with the standards of conduct and the criminal statutes. And just because you're not a filer does not mean that you are not subject and that you don't have the liability that's associated with having engaged in some conduct that was in violation of the standards of conduct or the criminal statutes. So I think it's short-sighted. I think it's unfair to employees, and everybody out there can say, well, your regulation doesn't require anything above and beyond that, and that's absolutely true. So I think there's fault all around here to be, if we're going to cast blame. But I think beyond blame casting, I think it's a matter of being very pragmatic and very thoughtful about what the purpose of ethics education and training is and how we can provide that. And we don't really need to have a regulatory requirement to provide these things. There are various ways that we can educate and raise awareness for employees that doesn't have to be formal training, right? I mean, you've seen like newsletters and things like that.
One of the best parts of training, and this wasn't even part of an annual training requirement, but I was at an agency where what they decided to do was during Halloween, they sent out a email to all employees, and they said, come to the ethics office and get your treat. And employees came and they had some candy on the table, and as employees picked up the candy, they gave them one of the 14 ethical principles. Right. So in getting the candy, they came down for a treat, but they actually got some ethics. So it was one of those things where it was very simple, very basic, but what they shared was that they got more requests for advice, because in some cases those employees that were coming to the ethics office, although they were coming for candy, they've never been to the ethics office before.
Right.
And in some cases they didn't even know that the agency existed, that the ethics office is. So it's things that are very simple. I was at another agency where for initial ethics orientation training, what they did was they put together a binder, and it was actually given to senior leadership. And they put together a binder, and in the front of the binder it said, do you want your name in the Washington Post? And all it was clippings, newspaper clippings of actual ethics violations that had occurred throughout the executive branch. And it was extremely effective, because what happened was the agency leadership took interest, because of course, they didn't want to be in that same position, because some of those agencies, some of those names, or some of those articles addressed that particular agency as well.
Right.
So it was very effective. You don't have to do a lot. I mean, you would be very surprised at the number of practices, or number of model practices that we see in the area of education and training that don't cost a lot. That you wouldn't think that they would be as effective as they are, but you wouldn't believe how effective some of those techniques are. I was at a law enforcement agency once, and what they did was they incorporated actual movie clips. And it was it had a value-based ethics approach, but they used movie clips, and then from those movie clips they incorporated and talked about certain ethical violations that they could potentially encounter while on the job. And it was one of those trainings where it was extremely effective. It didn't cost them much in terms of man hours, but it was extremely effective.
I mean, I think that's one of the areas where ethics officials do feel a little pinched when it comes to education and training, because I think, and we're all guilty of this, I think we want to be thinking more in terms of formal, structured training, and really what we need to be doing is thinking a little bit more outside of the box about awareness opportunities that, as you're suggesting, can be, as relatively simple as, handing out candy with a little bit of advice, or, so I think that's sort of a challenge for ethics officials, because we do think about, developing training being a time-consuming activity, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be that.
Yeah, I tell ethics officials all the time that you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Right.
There are some excellent PowerPoint presentations out there. There's some excellent presentations that ethics officials are willing to share. All you have to do is kind of tweak it to your needs. But in the area of education and training, I always say that you can be the most creative. You can you can actually, quote unquote, think outside the box when it comes to that area. But one of the things that that we always want to see, although the requirement doesn't require it, is that we do want to see where employees are trained, where all employees are trained, given the fact that even how we have defined what's considered verbal-based training, and computer-based training is one. It really would benefit the program to look at the opportunity to train everyone. But also, this is another tidbit that I always share with ethics officials, that we don't have to wait until October, November, December to provide the training. That in itself is a model practice, right? Because so often we see, and there may be some out here now that are struggling to meet compliance.
Wire, yes, exactly.
But training is one of those things that you can do all year long. There's no requirement for that.
Yeah. And again, I mean, I think coming up with tools like, newsletters and things like that, because I think we talk about training again, but I think if we think about it more like awareness raising, and if you can think about raising awareness, there are a gazillion ways that you can put product out there, even just emails or newsletters or things like that, just to put it in front of people so that it's kind of a reminder that, we have these obligations, and this is where the ethics shop, this is where we are.
Absolutely.
Come find us. This is our extension. That we're here to help. So one other point I wanted to sort of track back to on the education and training piece that I think is really important, and you emphasized it in the program administration part, and I think you can't emphasize it enough in every element of your program, and that's leadership support. And I think that having your leadership, whether it be at the sort of like supervisory, like first line supervisor level, or the sort of like management, higher management level, but having them send a clear and recurring message that they believe that ethical conduct is important, and sort of reinforcing that with their staff. Sure. is just, I think, really critical. And so I'm sort of excited because it sounds like you're seeing more of that, like you're seeing more of that involved even in the initial ethics orientation.
Yeah, we are. Even from the standpoint, I tell ethics officials all the time that particularly when we see letters of support from leadership encouraging the ethics program, one thing that you can consider, and we've recognized it as a model practice, is that each time there's a leadership change, that try to have that particular leader provide a letter of support to the program. I have seen some horror stories where we've had some situations where letters were still being used from prior.
Oh dear!
And so,
this person isn't here anymore, but they really believe in ethics.
But yeah, every time that there's a new change, this is a perfect opportunity to have that particular person lend his support to the program. There's another thing that we always share, particularly when it comes back. Touch back on financial disclosure one time. Well, another again, is that the regulation requires that we have written procedures for the financial disclosure. What we consider to be a model practice also is when you have written procedures for all other elements of your ethics program. And that's very important for succession planning.
Yes.
We have identified that there's heavy turnover in the ethics office. And one of the ways that we often see is that when an ethics official comes to a new agency, generally there are no marching orders, or there are no step-by-step procedures on how it used to be done or how it was done before I got here. Generally, what we find is that when an ethics official comes on, a new ethics official comes to an agency, they're almost starting from scratch.
Right.
And one thing that I've seen one agency in particular do is that, particularly when it came to succession planning, they put together written procedures for all elements of the program outside of financial disclosure. But then they also, every time an ethics official left, they sat him in front of a video camera and they asked him or heard certain questions, and those questions were kept for the next person to come on board. And it was more of the institutional knowledge of the agency.
Right.
It was to kind of understand why certain things were done that particular way.
Right.
And it was just great in terms of looking at, when we look at having an effective ethics program, you really can't have a good program without having a succession plan. And OGE, we are practicing what we preach. We also develop written procedures for all elements of our day-to-day activities. And so that's the same message that we provide to agencies, that outside of the written requirements that you provide written procedures for financial disclosure, we also look to see if you have procedures that govern all other aspects of the program, and we consider that to be a model practice as well. And what happens is we retain certain material, and we're more than happy to share things with agencies when they're looking for assistance in putting together those procedures.
And among those written procedures, are you talking also then about can you speak a little bit to tracking systems and databases and just kind of basic things that you would almost expect most, if not all, programs to have, and sort of how that fits into the scheme of things too?
Yeah, and it's different. When you talk about tracking systems, a tracking system for a small agency is very different than a tracking system for a cabinet level agency.
I would hope. Yes.
For tracking system, we've seen a tracking system for a small micro agency that it was just a checklist. It had names and they just checked off names. That was their tracking system. We've been to agencies that had more elaborate, third party software in terms of tracking. we really don't prescribe to a specific way to track, but when we don't see agencies tracking at all, which we have seen, that does become a problem. What we do like to see, even for the micro agencies that maybe have 1 or 2, 3 or 4 filers, we do like to see some form of tracking, because what we always want the ethics official to do, particularly for those that have been administering the program for a number of years, what we like to get that person to do is to think about, if you left the agency tomorrow, could someone step in your shoes and operate the program the same way you do? And generally, if the answer is no, then it's a good idea to try to develop procedures and that would kind of ensure a good succession plan. But we've seen tracking systems in a number of different ways. Again, we don't expect a small agency to have an elaborate tracking system, but we do expect agencies to have tracking systems.
Some
right,
form,
exactly.
in some form or fashion, even if it's on the back of an envelope.
Exactly.
There's got to be something.
Exactly. And those things we share with the community. We share. Sometimes we provide suggestions throughout our reports. They don't raise to a level of a corrective action, but and those are the things that we suggest to agencies, that to look at the ethics program from a succession planning standpoint. And generally, if you look at it from that point of view, there are a lot of processes and procedures that you can put down on writing, put down on paper, that really would make your program that more effective.
Right. Well, it's funny because you were talking about sort of like the need to track in the case of like financial disclosure and things like that, and even at the education and training, and I can think of a variety of reasons why that's important, succession planning being one of them. I'm wondering about like advice and counsel. Like that's an area, it seems to me, where you're not only talking about concerns for succession planning, but if you have like a multi ethics official shop, it seems to me that even as you're running the program, it's important that everybody kind of knows what everybody else is saying about things. So I'm curious
Absolutely.
what you found in the area of advice and counsel.
Well, the good thing, because the requirement, again, what we find when it comes to advice and counseling, we do see a lot of, particularly in large systems or large agencies, we do find tracking systems that are actually tracking the question that comes in. I was just at an agency the other week where they have a dedicated email that's dedicated to having ethics questions come in to the ethics office, and they use that as a tracking mechanism. Not only does it secure the question, but they also use it as a record.
Gotcha.
Then we've seen agencies that there are no. We get the question all the time, are there any third-party softwares out there that would help in tracking the advice and counseling? There are none that we would prescribe to, but what we do want to see is that you are maintaining, particularly when you have ethics officials, 4 or 5 ethics officials in an ethics shop, we do want to see that you have a tracking system that is maintaining what the question was, what the answer that you provided, and you can use that as a historical record of the and tracking purposes of what you've provided to the agency. That's one of the things that we generally suggest, if not recommend, when we see agencies that don't have a tracking system when it comes to advice and counseling. But generally, the tracking systems that we do find there, from the basic the basic Microsoft Word to more elaborate systems.
Right.
But the key is that when you are providing advice and counseling in writing, that you do want to track not only the question, but you also want to provide the answer to the question as well.
Well, it's interesting because I think that agencies vary somewhat wildly, I think, in the degree and extent to which they necessarily document their answers in writing. And I know that it's not per se a requirement to document your answers in writing, but I mean, clearly you're pointing it to something that we think is a good practice. And this is the next piece I'm going to want you to sort of touch on. You can answer it however you want to, but the segue us into the next piece, which is, I know that for purposes of enforcement, I know that IG's offices have emphasized continuously with us how important it is for them that there be documentation of advice and counsel, that there be documentation of receipt of training, that those kind of things make a difference for them as well when it comes to any kind of an allegation of misconduct.
Absolutely. What you don't want is a tracking system. You don't want an email tracking system. That's what we find is that your email of the advice
your
coming
inbox.
in, or your inbox
Right.
is the tracking system. But absolutely, one of the aspects that we always taught with the IGs as part of our program review, and one of the things that we often hear, one of the things that we need as well when we're doing a review, is that we want to have some evidence that that the advice was provided to the filer, and that there's a receipt of the education that the filer received, either annual training or as IEO. So it is a good practice, not only from the perspective of investigations, which we hear a lot from the IG, that sometimes we're not able to go forward because the ethics office may not have documented extremely well the advice that was rendered to the employee, or even documented the receipt of the training. But those are when we don't see those type of situations. Those are things that we do recommend. But when we see it working effectively, we see a program where there's a system where if I can ask you, can you provide me with evidence of 208 that you provided in the last year, that you have a system that you can identify all the 208 pieces of advice that you've provided within that given year. We'd like to see a tracking system like that. For smaller agencies, we understand that it might not be as elaborate as that, but when appropriate, we want to see that a lot of times we don't see agencies documenting their advice in writing. And that's one of the things that we constantly taught or address with agency ethics officials, that you want to try to document as much as possible. But it is a good practice, and we always suggest when we do see documentation, we do and the tracking of it, we do look at that as being a model practice.
Are there other areas in the area of enforcement in terms of like relationships between ethics shops and IG shops? Are there other model practices that you've seen, or that you would, or things that you've observed that you would encourage agencies to consider?
Well, having a good working relationship with the Inspector General
Yes.
is a model practice in itself. We see a lot of times, unfortunately, that it's not a good working relationship between the two,
Right.
and there are various responsibilities both on the IG side and on the ethics side that really require a good working relationship, particularly when it comes to referring criminal conflict of interest violations to the Department of Justice. The ethics office needs to be in a position to, although we know that you're not part of the investigation of it, but generally the IG does need to know or want to know the more specifics of the ethics part of it. So it does. Sometimes we see, and we always suggest that it doesn't go over well with some ethics officials, but one of the model practices that we share with the IG community is that during the times in which OGE is not doing a review at that particular agency, that they look at doing their audits, incorporating some aspects of compliance of ethics. So for instance, when they're doing an audit, they may look at whether the agency is in compliance with the timely filing of financial disclosure reports, or whether they are in compliance with the timely completion of training for both initial and annual. We do share that as a model practice to the IG community when we meet with them.
Right.
And then we do share with the ethics office the model practice of documenting as much as possible in order to allow the IGs to fully use that for their investigations.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I can understand why, on some level. I mean, nobody likes to have to be criticized or to be in a position of being criticized, and so I can understand why maybe some ethics officials might bristle at that recommendation. Although, I mean, I'm not making a statement one way or the other about it. But I guess my question to you is, as an alternative, it seems to me that ethics programs themselves can do some self-evaluations.
Absolutely.
And do you see that, and have you
do.
seen that?
Yeah, we absolutely do. One of the things that we look at, and we actually ask the question during review: do you actually self-evaluate your own, assess your own program? And we've seen agencies that actually they have a mini program review team where they go in, particularly for cabinet level agencies. They have a team of dedicated officials that they go in and evaluate the components ethics program. Generally, we always see that as a model practice, because any time that there's more attention and focus to the compliance aspects of the ethics program, it's always a good thing. So we definitely see self-assessments. We see agencies providing questionnaires to their own employees. We actually, not too long ago, I was at an agency that actually implemented a self-evaluation on not only the ethics program, but what they were also doing was they were sending out evaluations to their financial disclosure filers to try to get a handle on what parts of the financial disclosure program that they didn't understand. And I thought that was very interesting, because what they were seeing was that there were a lot of technical deficiencies in terms of the reporting of certain things on the report. So they did a questionnaire to their filers to kind of gauge them on what challenges that they were having in filling out the form. And then they used that information to either develop better instructions or to kind of walk them through the aspects of filling out the form correctly. So I thought that was very good. But we often see agencies self-assess. We actually see that more than ever now, and I think maybe because during our questionnaires we focus on self-assessments, but we really see that more than we've ever seen before.
Well, that's encouraging.
Yeah.
So for the folks first of all, are there any other model practices that we haven't touched on that you had wanted to highlight today?
I think we probably in the area of financial disclosure, I think it's very challenging. A lot of these are case specific, so we've seen a lot of different model practices when it comes to identifying those that are in a covered position. We've seen that a lot in the education and training division. We've seen a lot of creativity in the model practices that are shared, but generally we are actually identifying a lot more model practices than we've ever identified before as well. And I think that's credited to our agency leadership and the importance that we place on agency leadership and on ethics officials in support of the program. But yeah, I think agency ethics officials are doing a very good job in trying to implement as best they can
to move beyond
compliance.
Yeah, because that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about kind of like stepping up your game and making sure that your program does, at the very base minimum, that it's compliant, but that you're trying to find ways to make it more effective and more transparent and more accountable. So with respect to these model practices that you find, do we have a list of them somewhere? How can folks out there find out about other agencies' model practices?
Well, during our reviews, we provide a list of model practices that we've come across just as a basic service. That's part of being our friendly ethics consultation.
Indeed.
But we also list several model practices on our website, oge.gov. And then we're also available during the reviews as well as anytime thereafter, that if there's a question that we get asked all the time is, we want to know how another agency of comparable size is handling this particular challenge. And we all know that there's nothing new under the sun. And what we share those model practices through our website. We share those model practices through reports that we issue. We share those model practices while on site. We also go a step further by incorporating or working with our desk officers and sharing the model practices that we've seen at their particular agencies that they're assigned to, and then ultimately they are in a position to pass on that information to the other agencies that they're assigned as well.
So one strategy that folks could take is if they are, looking for best practices or model practices to go in and, for example, look at the reports that we've issued and maybe find an agency that's of similar size and similar constitution and read the report and see if there's anything in the report that would be there. And on the website itself, do we actually have a list of
Yes,
okay.
Yes, it's a growing list, but we do have a list on our website. If you type in model practices in the search engine on our website, some of the model practices that we've identified at a number of agencies will appear. It may not speak specifically to the challenge that an agency is currently addressing, that they may want to know how, what's a best practice or best way to approach it. And that's when you can always, we're a phone call away, you can, contact the desk officer or contact us, where we're more than happy to share some of the practices that we've seen at other agencies. But definitely the OG website is a start, as well as the reports that we issue. We always incorporate model practices that we find in written reports that we provide to agencies.
Okay, so there are multiple ways that folks can find out about these, and that's I think that's really key, is making sure that folks who want that information can readily get that information. Well, I think if you're good to go and you're open to it, we can open up the lines and take questions from anybody who has questions. So, Sheila, if we can open up the phone lines for any questions on the phone line, and for people who are on the Hangout, if you want to ask a question, you can use the app, which is in the right part of your screen, and you can ask a question, and David will do his level best to answer for you.
Thank you. If you would like to ask a question by phone, please press *1, unmute your phone, and record your name clearly. Your name is required to introduce your question. If you need to withdraw your question, press *2. Again, to ask a question by phone, please press *1. It will take a few moments for the questions to come through. Please stand by.
Thank you.
Again, as a reminder, to ask a question by phone, you may press *1 and record your name at the prompt. One moment, please. I am showing no questions by phone at this time.
Okay, thank you, Sheila. Well, it seems as if we have no questions on the Hangout either. David, I can't thank you enough again for joining us today. I think you've provided everybody with a lot of really good feedback and a lot of really good information on how initiatives that they can take to enhance their programs and make their programs just stronger, and a sensibility, too, about what they can expect if they do get that phone call that the Compliance Division is coming out, and they are friendly program analysts who will be coming to your agencies to walk you through your program. And in all earnestness, I mean, that is the function of the program review, is certainly to make sure that programs are in compliance, but also to assist folks who are struggling for whatever reason with certain aspects of their program, and to help enhance the program, the quality of the program.
Sure.
So we will see you next week. For those of you who are interested to attend our Advanced Practitioner Series next Thursday at noon, will be an introduction to risk management. I'm Cheryl Kane-Piasecki, and I thank you very much for your time today, and we hope to see you again here next week.
That concludes today's conference.